Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist. Join me as I seek out the small incremental changes being applied in other industries that we can learn from and that can be applied in healthcare. Can these changes bring immediate value, but also add up to the big improvements and revolution we need in healthcare? Come along with me to explore the possibilities. My innovative guests from around the globe have used small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot. And today, I'm excited to be talking to Bill Rogers, the CEO of Orbita. Bill, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Dr. Nick. Thanks for having me on the show.
So this is exciting for me because we're going back to some of my original roots and speech recognition, the use of voice and some of the tools and the challenges around this. But before we do, could you share a little bit about your background and what you've done in the past and what you're currently doing?
Great. Yes. Before Orbita, I was the CEO of a company that was involved in web content and experience management. It was a company called Ektron. We had 13,000 deployments of our technology. And ultimately, it walked us through the first two waves of the internet, which was the web and mobile, and building a platform for allowing non-technical people to be able to create, manage, use the context of what's happening to drive the right experience to users.
Fantastic. So when you talk about content management, just so that I make sure people understand, help us understand what that means. What exactly was your company and your product doing?
Yeah, so if you had a website like Cerner or McKesson, they were using our product. What they're doing is that they have marketing people that are creating content for people to be able to look at, but they're creating campaigns, and the campaigns are driving them down a funnel to execute something, to have them fill out a form, join a webinar, but it's a WYSIWYG environment. It's using context that, so when you go to a web page there and another person goes to a web page, they have two different experiences because we look at the context of where you're coming from and a lot of other stuff that most people didn't even know that was available.
So if I'm understanding that correctly, it's a customized view for everybody that showed up at the same location. They would get a different perspective and a different view.
Exactly.
So that's the history, and you've been through a number of cycles, and you're now at Orbita. And what does Orbita do, and how did that come about?
This third revolution, what we're seeing is now natural language. Natural language is where people are engaging instead of clicking through a mobile app or interacting through a website. They're actually using voice. So this wave of smart speakers from organizations like Google and Amazon are going to change the way that we interact. It's going to become a new media. And of course, chatbots is also a way to engage when chatbots are in mobile apps and chatbots that are in the websites. So when you think about a chatbot, some of the things that we think about as chatbots is actually having voice to drive that experience as well. So you're doing less typing and you're driving a natural experience by asking the questions that you want to have answered.
So how did that come about? So that's quite different from content management, or at least it appears so on the surface.
Yeah, so if you start to think about it, when you're driving an experience for engaging patients, so the problem that we're looking at is patient engagement today. So before Ektron, I was a CTO of a telemedicine company. I worked with Dr. Kaveda of Mass General, and we were building some home care solutions. And at the time, 1997 and 98 was early in those days. And so the technology didn't exist to do what we needed to do. So now you fast forward and you see the way that we engage with patients at home today. It's mostly through mobile apps. Unfortunately, what we see is that the people that probably need the care the most have the most difficulty of using a mobile app. And so in comes voice from things like Alexa and Google Home and other types of devices. and you see that the friction for them to be able to interact is dramatically being reduced.
So I couldn't agree more. Obviously, voice is the interface that we're most comfortable with. For people that can't read and write, they can definitely communicate by voice. I obviously have worked in the past for companies, some of whom you've talked about, Nuance certainly in the current realm. But the challenge has always been, how do you enable that voice interaction? And specifically, our capacity to understand things is really very complex. So we use multiple phrases to mean the same thing, especially the English language I know is particularly complex. I have many international friends who complain about learning English. I feel the same about learning other languages, just to be clear. But it's a real challenge to create an interface that is as intelligent as the interaction that you and I have together in this conversation. So what is it that you're doing to enable that?
So we sit on top of the natural language processors like Google and Amazon, and you look at where they've evolved in the last 3 years. Realistically, before 3 years ago, in trying to interact with patients at home, it just really wasn't possible. The error rates of understanding was too high. And now those error rates have dramatically came down. Now, that being said, it isn't a magic box where you just create something and it's going to answer every single question. You really have to work in creating work with a voice user experience design to understand what's the problem that you're trying to solve. And as you drive people, and you're really bringing people down through a flow, and I call it a funnel. And so, although they can ask anything, you're really trying to have them complete some sort of task. So you're enabling the information through voice cues, or when you're doing chatbots, where you have something like an Echo Show, you're showing what we would call smart buttons that give the person potential options of what their next choices are, so they're not confused on what to do. And part of that voice user experience, when it's just voice, is that as they get prompted for asking them a question, or if they ask a question, you have a response, you have a reprompt that has much more information that can clarify stuff if they're confused.
So the inspiration for this seems as if it was the content management, that custom presentation layer. So what was your insight? Can you think back to that time that you moved into this?
So if you think about a content management system and you think about what we're trying to do and what we're accomplishing, is that we have a platform, a portal that allows you to manage the experiences. And so part of those experiences are done by non-technical people. You're creating content. In this case, it's voice content. You have a WYSIWYG voice editor that you allow people to interact through voice. You also have an editor that's how the content would come out as in a chatbot. So because what you say is not how you would actually see it if you were seeing it in a chatbot. And there's another tab that you see, which is the display, because what you would put on the screen on an Echo Show or on a tablet while you're engaging through voice is not what you would be reading. It's not a concept of just hearing and seeing. And then we have another tab in every one of the author experiences to see what we call smart buttons. Where are we trying to drive them and guide them through next after they've listened to the piece of content? And so there's that layer. Then there's a layer below that is the actual designer. We call it an experience designer. It's a visual flow designer. And that visual flow designer lets you create the interactions with the user through flows, and frankly connect to other AI engines that allow you to create more robust, use more microservices, so that when we engage with larger organizations that have back-end information that they're trying to collect, or some sort of care plan that's trying to execute on, that we have the integration points to interact with.
So as you think back to the journey to get here, you obviously saw that similarity to the content management and the presentation layer, and separating that out and providing essentially the tool set that allows people to create something without understanding the complexity behind the scenes, right?
Correct.
as you think about your journey to get here, so obviously at some point you realized that that was the way to create web pages that were far more useful in the content. Can you remember, was there anything specifically that stood out to you that got you to that point of innovation?
So we were in the same stage when we were in the web content management world. So we didn't start out as a web content management. We started out as a WYSIWYG editor. And at that point, we sold 25,000 of these WYSIWYG editors where people were building these homegrown solutions. And truth be told, 90% of what you're seeing out there on an Alexa and Google Home is that you're just writing code, which is great until a marketer says, I don't like how that sounds. How can I go change that? And they say, well, okay, we just have to pass this to the developer and he needs to make the change. And that's where people would talk about the webmaster bottleneck. And that bottleneck's now happening in the voice world. And the same thing, it happens when you build a platform, you see patterns and you build technology to support those patterns. And so when someone starts from scratch, they have to build and reproduce all that technology that's a pattern. So one pattern is, how do I create content through a calendar? Or how do I create content in a taxonomy that allows me to, once you say something, you know where you're going to drive them through. But then today we can use things like knowledge graphs to build relationships. So those are all out of the box functionality in Orbita, as opposed to you starting from scratch and trying to write it by hand.
Fantastic. So can you share some examples or some of the experiences that you've had with the Orbita tool, perhaps with your co-developers or co-conspirators, whatever they happen to be?
Yes, so we now have about 25 customers that are using our platform and driving solutions out into the marketplace. And so some of them are companies like American Red Cross. We're working also with companies like the Mayo Clinic. And when you think about wellness companies, we're working with companies like Stay Well. And we're working with remote patient management companies like a Medtronic. And again, there's a lot of similarities. So when you work with a pharmaceutical company like an Amgen and you're delivering a clinical trial through a smart speaker, you're ultimately engaging with them to educate the user on how to use the voice speaker. You're educating them on what types of things that they can do, like their daily, weekly, monthly assessments, their ability to ask knowledge questions, the ability to understand the context of where are they in the journey. If it's day one, you might be responding with more robust answers than you would if it's day 2 or day 10, where the person's now used to using it and doesn't want the long-winded response coming back. They want a more concise.
Fantastic. So for those of you just joining, I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist, and today I'm excited to be talking to Bill Rogers, the CEO of Orbita, a company that is essentially trying to present a different tool set for people to design voice into applications where voice is desperately needed, but it's a challenge to actually implement. And we were just talking about some examples. You've obviously got a slew of customers that are doing this. Can you share an example of one of the applications that's in use today?
Yeah, so if you went to Alexa and you installed the Mayo Clinic First Aid, that would be an example of a voice experience where when you're interacting with it, you can ask any question about first aid. Let's say that you asked about choking and you would get a response on choking, but after you've heard a definition of what choking is, it would ask you for symptoms or treatment. And then you would say treatment. Now you can imagine with Mayo Clinic First Aid, there is a lot of treatment questions. So, but it knows that you're in the context of choking. And so it answers the treatments for choking. And then after that, it will say, well, do you want treatment for adults or children? These are the navigation prompts that you hear that help the person to navigate to find the information that they're looking for. and then they could switch the question. They could say, no, I want first aid on a spider bite, and now they're in a completely different branch of the taxonomy where they can start interacting with that information as well.
So as I listen to that, one of the things that occurs to me is that it sounds quite complicated to create those trees. But when we talked about this some time back, you shared that this really wasn't the case. I mean, to design something like that, what's the sort of the process, the experience, time frame?
In this case, we built it over about a 5 to 6 week period of time. And actually, all of the content that was associated with first aid was entered by the Mayo Clinic. Their content contributors, they created it, and so as they just looked at the structure, they looked and said, okay, how are we going to split this up? And they came up with this pretty high level concept of we're going to have a basic definition, and then sub to that are going to be treatments. And another branch would be symptoms, and they could have, and then depending upon the topic, they could have subtopics to those, like sub-treatments. And so, because they're in a WYSIWYG environment, it's like you're working inside of Word, except for your control buttons are for doing things like adding pauses or adding emphasis, because voice is different than how you read, and you would want to be able to control that. And sometimes you select some content in the way that it's said, because it's a word that's used in a medical response. You might need to change how it's said, but how it sounds by changing some controls in a WYSIWYG environment to do that.
So it's really taking sort of a completely different perspective on the sort of design process, presentation layer separated, and different presentation layers. In this instance, you're talking about a visual, and that presentation layer changes. Much as we've sort of absorbed this concept of mobile is a different interface for people to design for the web versus a regular browser. So fascinating sort of insights, and I love that transfer of knowledge. So it leads me to the obvious next question. It sounds like you've created this tool set, and given the presentation from Google Duplex of their AI that seemed to just beat out the Turing test right there and then, yes. You're essentially saying that we can take your tool set and design a Google Duplex tomorrow?
Yes. I think what you see from Google is exciting. And I think what you see when you have competition from organizations like Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, that you see things move forward in a very quick way. And so this next thing that Google announced, it is really quite amazing. If you think about, you now could call someone and ask them, are you Dr. Nick? And you answer yes. Okay, we'd like to start asking you a few questions about a pain threshold or some sort of patient outputs that you would want to report on, and it's really a game changer because it sounds so natural that the person in some ways is just going to think they're talking to a real person as opposed to an AI engine.
And highly positive, but also a little bit terrifying, because now suddenly our capacity to differentiate between machine and human is starting to blend in a way that is going to challenge our sense of reality. And I know there are certainly folks who believe that we are living in an augmented reality, virtual reality instance. I'm not sure that I subscribe to that, but maybe it's true. I don't know. Very exciting to sort of see where this could go. You saw the Duplex, the Google Duplex demo.
Exactly.
What did you think? What was your immediate impression?
No, it was exciting, again, because it sounded so natural. And, if you think about the audio world, this word duplex, and where this is really going is full duplex. So just like as you're having the conversation, we'll interrupt each other. And, the current technology didn't support interruptions, but the next generation is going to support it, and because it's going to support it, again, becomes much more of a natural conversation. And that's where this is what's so exciting and where it's leading to, that it actually can solve pretty complex. And as you've seen from the demonstration, it's dealing with all of these sort of crazy ways that people would answer or ask a question, and the AI engine needs to interpret that and get to a state where it needs to come back with the right response.
Yeah, so give listeners a sense of what it would take to achieve that in their setting. And obviously, I've got a slant towards healthcare, but it's not exclusive healthcare. It's consumer-orientated healthcare and patient-related. What's the process? I mean, how does somebody go about achieving that level of interaction? And what are the steps that they would need to take?
So what we're seeing in healthcare won't be different than any other industry. A lot of the organizations are doing pilots. So the most common way to get started is to start with a pilot, but you actually spend more time on what we call the voice UX. It's almost like a Visio diagram of what are you trying to get accomplished, and what directions do you want people to go in. And in each one of those, you create, what are you going to say, what are you going to display, and what would you have it for text as a you basically number every one of your bubbles in your Visio diagram, and then create the voice and the display information of what you're going to do. But then you have to, what's hard is, because it's a natural language processor, do you lock someone into the conversation so that they're going down a flow and you keep them going down that flow? Or do you keep it open-ended and so that they can jump and go all over the place? And truth be told, the organizations that are successful at it, they do a little bit of both. There's times where you're walking through, for example, an assessment survey, and you're trying to get the 5 or 8 questions done. And if they say something else, it will repeat the question, tell them a little bit of how they can answer this question, and ultimately gets them the answers. Because ultimately there's a purpose for asking the assessment, and it's this value of getting the answers to that information when you're a remote patient, you're being monitored, and you need to be asked a few questions to know whether or not somebody really needs to physically pick up a phone and call you.
Yeah, so I think my one of my desires in all of this is that we hear the end of, please listen carefully, our menu options have changed.
Yes, that's
Will
right.
die its death ultimately, because that as a concept, first of all, it's ancient and it stays in place for years sometimes. But that open-ended capacity and designing for as many possibilities. And then I guess one of the things that I saw in the Duplex demo was the failing gracefully, where the conversation didn't go in the direction that you would expect. So anyway, we're unfortunately out of time. It's always runs too quickly. So I just wanted, before we close, if you could just give us a sense of where you think this technology is going and how people can get engaged. What would be the one small step?
I think people need to think about this at the same stage of a mobile app. When mobile applications came, people were like, do we need this? Do we need to invest into this? And this is another channel. And what you're going to find is just it's a lower friction, and you need to start testing it now and getting some experience with it, because it's going to be very important to your strategy as time goes on.
So it's a bright future, a frictionless environment with true Star Trek interaction with technology that's going to simplify our worlds. Orbita is definitely a part of that future, and an exciting time, especially with some of the progress that we've seen. So Bill, thank you very much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure to catch up and hear a little bit more about the work that you've been doing.
Thanks, Dr. Nick.
So thanks for joining me today. Do you have any better ideas, or have you found small incremental changes that have brought about a big improvement in your world? Let's continue the conversation on our hashtag, The Incrementalist, or share with me at Dr. Nick1 on Twitter. You can find out more information about the show on our program page at healthcarenowradio.com. And tune in next time to hear my discussion with leaders and innovators from around the globe who've revolutionized their space by using small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist, starting the revolution through evolution.